If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. On this episode, I want to change what we're talking about a little bit, get a little away from the typical. And I'll tell you what I mean. I want to think about how to go about having a meaningful career. By meaningful, I mean you create value, you make a good living, and the work-life balance problem goes away because you do something that you think is valuable and meaningful. There are challenges to this. So in this episode, we'll identify those challenges and how to overcome them. I'll bring in some authors who talk about this stuff, and we'll combine some ideas and identify a path and some helpful processes for you to use going forward. I usually talk about attention compass. An attention compass is an operating system for people who really know what they need to do to be successful. And it's for them a question of keeping track of that and how do we get additional motivation to do what we know we need to do? How do we get rid of waste around being aware of what we need to do and getting it done? So attention compass can be helpful for people that are trying to figure that part out, if you've got a process for figuring it out. But if you don't know what to do, attention compass is probably not going to help you get it done. If you don't know what to do and can't figure it out, then you're not going to be interested in attention compass because you're actually wanting to wait and be told the next thing to do and then do it. So attention compass is very much about being proactive in the world. And this is proactive from a Covey perspective, proactive in the sense of taking control of your situation. And because that's my focus and the focus of this podcast, I rarely talk about that next layer up, which is this whole business about what do we need to do to have that career? How do we have a thriving career in the knowledge work economy? And I think this applies whether you're new to career or whether you're in mid-career and just looking for some ways to add a little extra juice, a little extra horsepower. So let's talk about that. Now, the first author's name I'll drop is Seth Godin, and you probably recognize his name. He's written a few different books, but the one we'll look at today is called Linchpin. It's a few years old, but he's got some things to say about being successful in the modern knowledge work economy, which we do talk a lot about here on the podcast. And I usually talk about it from the standpoint of getting better at knowledge work and this whole area around the overall productivity of knowledge workers. And Godin really talks about that in this book. So I'm normally about the micro level, the very base level of productivity, about fixing the waste of your attention and to a lesser degree, the waste of your time, about what challenges you face trying to keep up with your stuff. And so this is that next level. It's more strategic. How should we position ourselves such that we can have impact? How can we arrange our work so that we create value in the work? And since we create value, we get a share of that value. And then we can be economically successful. How can we arrange all of our work so we can get those things and be even emotionally fulfilled? So we'll dig into Godin's book for some ways to do that. Now, there are some obvious reasons that people don't do what Godin recommends, and we'll deal with that first. One of the big reasons is fear. In his talk on the book, Linchpin, Godin mentions a guy named Steven Pressfield, and I happen to be a fan. I've introduced him before on the podcast, but here we go again. Pressfield has written several books, and probably the one that he's actually most famous for is called The War of Art. And in this book, he talks about what do we do? How do we get motivated in the face of things that we don't want to do? How do you get psychologically motivated to do things that you really don't want to do when fear is a big part of not wanting to do it? Now, if you've listened to the podcast, I talk about fear-based procrastination and fear-based perfectionism a good bit. And I think that's what's going on. And in his talk on Linchpin, Godin constantly refers to the lizard brain. And that's where the fear comes from, and that's how Pressfield comes in. So you've heard me say things like this before. The problem is that Godin wants us to do some pretty dramatic, pretty scary things. Now, Pressfield wants to help us to not be derailed by that fear. So this is why we're bringing these two guys together. So I hear you out there. Okay, Larry, where do you fit into this? Are you just going to talk about these two guys? Well, I'll say I'm more on the Pressfield side, but I think in addition to having psychological tools against the fear, which is where Pressfield is, we also need to have procedural tools against the fear. And that's where attention compass comes in and fits into the whole thing. So what we're going to talk about here is career growth opportunities, encouragement and tactics to avoid that fear-based procrastination when confronted with these kinds of activities that are so wildly valuable and meaningful and useful in the world. Then we can discuss how you deliver profitable value. And that is, how do you make a living doing the kinds of things that Godin recommends? Now, when we look at Godin and the Linchpin book in detail, the book is about this notion that work is changing, and I talk about this a lot. Back in the second half of the 20th century, you could make a good living doing the same thing over and over again. You could get really good at it, and that made it easier. It made it less stressful on you, and you just did the thing, and everything was fine. Linchpin is making the point that that position is really no longer available. It's fading very, very quickly in a race to the bottom. So what the book then says is, if your plan is to get really good at doing what you're told, that is good enough to make a living off of it, then you may need to address that plan and possibly come up with another one. Now, if you stop and think about, okay, how is it that doing what you're told is going to provide you with a good living and a meaningful set of activities? When we're thinking about this, a lot of people I talk to say, well, I'm going to be really good at it. And the truth is, being really good at being told what to do is probably not terribly valuable. I mean, there's a lot of people that are really good at doing what they're told to do. And if you're going to be good enough to deliver extra value, you've got to be better than 7 billion people. And that's what's happened. What do I mean? Well, about 20 years ago, Thomas Friedman wrote a book called The World is Flat. And he was talking about how computer-mediated communication would put us in competition with people all over the world who are very happy to make $20 a day. And now we're beginning to see that become reality. In a similar vein, Godin talks about the history of Mechanical Turk and how you can outsource minor jobs to anybody in the world for about $5. And so, as we're thinking through this, in a world like that, you have to be better than everybody else at what you do in order to make money. And think about that. Are you actually the GOAT, the greatest of all time in tax prep? Are you that much better than everybody else that you can command more than 10 times their fee? Godin plays the odds and says, well, that's probably not you. And he's probably right. And he makes the point that you can't just be really, really good. You got to be great. Because if you're the 150th best-selling writer in the world, then you're probably not making great money. As a note, book number 100 on New York Times 21st Century Sales List sold 58,000 copies. And going rate, that's maybe a couple of years of average income, and it probably took a couple of years to write. Now, if you're top 10 on this list, you're probably making great money. You're probably enjoying your life. And your biggest problem is to deal with writer's block. But that's the deal in that industry. Maybe only the top handful of people are actually making a good living. So Godin then talks about some other ways to get a valuable career and really brings forth some interesting ideas. For example, if you can really manage people, then you can make a good living because it's really hard to do it well. And when I say really manage people, what I mean is you've got to improve the value of the people under you physically and dramatically. In other words, the people that you manage have to be better just because you're there. And it's not anything other than that. That's how good you have to be if you want to be in that career. Similarly, if you can galvanize a community and get them to act, if you wield that kind of leadership, if you can stand up in front of a room of 150 people and get half of them to actually take an action, then you're great and you can make a living there. You don't have to have a Nobel laureate IQ in order to get into one of these positions. You just have to be curious and think through how to solve problems. Because if you solve people's problems and remove people's pain, you can make a great living. I suggest that one of the things that Godin's really attacking is this following notion. I'm going to go to high school and do a 4-year college degree, and then I'm going to be sitting in my career and I'll make a great living for the next 40 years. Godin would suggest that's probably not true, that there's too much competition. As an example, middle management is the way to get from entry-level management to top management, and top management is where the cash is. But even as we go through 2025, people are debating the value of middle management. And we go through these cycles every once in a while where everybody fires all their middle managers. So the value of that is really hard to establish, and tenure in those positions is very, very short. Now, he said you got to be so good at managing people that they're visibly better with you than without you. And if that's true, then you can make a living there. But probably the best way to make a living is to form your own company. And from experience, if you're doing things that make people that much better, you're probably doing things that corporate HR doesn't want you doing. So we can't sit in these well-trod paths. You have to be the kind of person who's curious. You have to be able to solve problems. You have to be really tenacious about it. And you have to be consistently doing it. Now, Godin says that fear is the problem. Our lizard brain responds to fear. We say, hey, I'm going to do this new thing that nobody's ever done before. And our lizard brain shuts us down. So he wants to talk about how to deal with the lizard brain. Enter Pressfield. So Pressfield has one set of things that he wants to talk about to help you deal with the lizard brain. And he talks about the interference that we feel when we're doing tasks, particularly those that may be risky or those that nobody has ever done before, the creative kind of risks, not the mountain climbing kinds of risks. When he talks about this, he's at the practical level, not the dreaming level. He talks about the resistance. He talks about it with respect to authors, but it applies to anybody who's creating. And that includes entrepreneurs and includes people who are doing the kinds of linchpin things that Godin insists are the valuable tasks in the knowledge work world. If you're going to be valuable here, you got to be a thought leader. You got to come up with new things, new solutions to people's problems. Well, when you do that, people don't know how to reassure you. If your thing is a new thing, then the people around you don't understand it. So the world doesn't have any way to reassure you. On the other hand, if you go to high school and go to college and get a degree and get a job and a well-understood career, there are people that will reassure you. You're doing what the culture tells you to do. But that's not anymore where these great careers come from. So Pressfield talks about all this and all that happens to us here the things that interfere with us actually producing our stuff. And as I mentioned, he calls these things the resistance. And he actually capitalizes it, resistance with a capital R, and he personifies it. And he talks about the resistance being the enemy. The resistance is this set of forces from whatever source that together conspire against us producing our stuff, producing our value. And Pressfield writes all about the mental tactics you need to not give in to this resistance. Pressfield talks about this, and Godin uses the example. You always hear about writer's block, but you never hear about truck driver's block or plumber's block. They don't have that problem. They just get up and do the thing. It doesn't matter whether they're sick or hungover or had a fight or whatever. They're just doing the thing. And so Pressfield really focuses on authors and writers. And he talks about how writer's block is, well, silly. You know, his cure is, wait a minute, you just write your stuff. That's the tactic. You write your stuff and you don't self-edit. Plumbers don't self-edit. Truck drivers don't self-edit. They just move the stuff and they do the best they can and get on with it. And so you got to have that mindset if you're being this creator kind of person. Now, another mistake that Pressfield talks about when he talks about the resistance, the muse, this mythical inspirer of great work, that's really not a thing, and it never has been. According to Pressfield, the reality is you produce a lot of stuff, and some of it's going to be great, and some of it's going to be bad, and a lot of it's going to be in between. The phrase, there are no great writers, there are just great editors, comes up. It's this kinds of thinking. So you go in, you sit down, you produce your words, you keep the good stuff, throw away the bad stuff. And that's really where Pressfield is when he talks about the resistance. The War of Art is really a workbook on facing down the resistance on a day-to-day basis. And Godin talks about this as well. Now, when he talks about it, he uses different examples. So in one case, he talks about long distance runners. And he talks about how some runners are great. And he says it's because they, quote, find a place to put the tired, unquote. Meaning they find a place to put that feeling of tiredness where it doesn't bother them. It's not on their mind. They put it over there in the corner, they close the door behind it, and that's where a tired lives. And then once they're done doing what they're doing, they'll deal with the tired. And Godin says, if you're going to do this, you got to have a place to put the lizard brain and the fear it generates. If you're going to do this linchpin thing, you got to build a place to put the lizard brain. And that's what Pressfield talks about. He helps us find a place to put the lizard brain. Because if you're going to be a linchpin, you're going to face the resistance. The resistance is going to trigger the lizard brain, and the lizard brain is going to try to interfere with you getting your work done. Now, there's other challenges. I alluded to this earlier. There aren't any mile markers along the way on the linchpin path. The reason mile markers work is because you looked up the route. Somebody else told you what the route is and what the distance was. It's going to be 426 miles. And then while you're going, you look at the mileposts and you're able to count down and you're able to say, oh, I'm making progress. And so because of that, you're able to keep that what's otherwise a pretty boring task of driving 426 miles. But you have these progress indicators so you know you're on the right track. Now, if you're out there in the linchpin world, you're not going to have mile markers because nobody can tell you how to do what you're doing. So you need to get comfortable with that. Get comfortable with a lot of things. The sales pitch, you better get comfortable with the sales pitch. We'll talk about why. You better get comfortable with putting your idea out there and get over the fear that somebody else is not going to like it. This is what Godin means when he talks about finding a place to put the lizard brain. Because when people say they don't like your stuff is when the lizard brain kicks in. As some proof of all this, let's look at the idea of innovation. Henry Ford famously said that he built cars without asking people what they wanted. He didn't have any marketing, he just built cars. And he said that if he had asked people what they wanted, they would have said they wanted a faster horse. And he didn't know how to build a faster horse, but he did know how to build a car. So he built the car and he started giving it to people, and then they understood. Nobody understood before they had their hands on a car. They all wanted a faster horse. So he had to build them a car and introduce them to it. And they're going, I don't want a car, I want a faster horse. And he's going, well, there's no such thing as a faster horse. Here's a car. And working through that resistance and that convincing. Interestingly enough, the iPhone is sort of the same way. Nobody was asking for an iPhone. Nobody understood what an iPhone was when it first came out. Steve Jobs didn't really understand it. His stated purpose for the device was he didn't want people carrying two devices around with them when they could just carry one. So he wanted to combine the pocket mobile phone and the pocket iPod so that people could take calls and listen to music. Of course, not at the same time, but on the same device. Basically, he wanted them to not have to carry two devices, and instead they could carry one. Well, as great an idea as that is, I just don't think carrying two things is that big a problem. I mean, I got two pockets. It doesn't bother me that much. So that idea in and of itself, in my opinion, is not going to change the world. So what happens with Jobs? Because he did change the world. I'm pretty sure he didn't know he was doing this until after he did it. What he did is he took the telephone, and the telephone is a device, and he turned it into software so that it would work on a computer. Now, the computer at this point was already good at doing these other things like iPod playing music. And so he just took the phone and he turned it into software. And that's the real brilliance of what he did. And that's why the iPhone was so successful. But nobody knew how to ask for that. Trust me, I was alive at the time. It was simply not an idea that anybody had. Everybody had apps for their phone, but nobody had a phone app for their computer. So the point of all this discussion of inventions and how inventions work is you're not going to get a lot of support if you're breaking new ground. People don't understand it until they can see it and touch it. And you can't explain it to people very easily because people have their own mindset. Remember, they want a faster horse. So again, that's where the resistance comes from. Now, the way we usually deal with resistance is we go and get reassurance. But as I said before, there's not any reassurance here. So the way we typically deal with the fear when we have fear is we say, well, other people have done this. But that's not available if you're out there in Linchpin land. So that's really the primary challenge of doing this thing. Now, there are risks as well. And it's pretty interesting because the risk that people think of when they're doing this is the risk that they'll invent something that nobody wants. I would suggest that's not a risk. I would suggest that's a guarantee. You'll invent something that nobody wants, and you'll do it in a way that nobody wants. They don't know to want it. They don't understand it. So you show it to them, and over time, hopefully they change their mind, and then they decide that they want it, but it's hard for them to know that in advance. So for those reasons, the risk is not so much that you'll invent something new that nobody wants. The risk is that you spend a whole bunch of time and effort along the way of doing this, and then you quit before it's done. The problem is nobody knows when you're done. Remember, there's no mile marker. You can only figure out when it's done after the fact. Oh, it turned out I was done. So done in this case is a lot more like cooking a steak than it is about baking cookies. And this is counter to so many of the other things that we do, so many of those mundane tasks that make up our lives. I mean, you can measure your progress through school. You get reassurance from test grades, getting promoted from grade to grade, and graduating from one school and going to the next. And you can always say, well, here's where I am on this path. And yes, this is favorable. I'm doing these things well, so it looks good. Well, that's for simple work and simple problems that everybody knows how to do. And that's how those simple things work, is you get that feedback. So the primary risk is that you spend a whole bunch of time and effort and then quit before you're done because the resistance wears you down. Now, I would say the other primary risk is not understanding the way to go about building a new thing, how to build a better mousetrap, so to speak. Now, the phrase build a better mousetrap and the world will beat a path to your door has never actually been true. And the problem is you can't sit around by yourself and think up what needs to happen. You've got to constantly be showing it to people, and you got to be getting their input and their feedback. You've got to be saying, hey, does this solve your problem? If I tweak it here, does that solve your problem better? Because if we or they already knew how to solve their problem, then I bet you somebody else is already doing it. And the only way to participate in that is to become an implementer. There is another way, and that's to figure out a better way to produce the same solution. And that's really hard. You can do it, but it's not easy. A lot of people have made a lot of money doing that. Domino's is not the first delivery pizza chain. So you can do it, but it's not easy. And you have to do the same things. You have to invent. You have to change a working process, and people will tell you that that breaks that process. Now, back to what I was saying before, to do this thing, you have to constantly be showing it to people. And that means you're going to have to sell. Most people are afraid of selling. And here's a word to help on that. The thing about selling is not really convincing people to change their minds and buy something that you want to sell them. That's really not what sales is. Sales is continually trying to find people who have the pain that you can solve and showing them that you can solve that pain. So it's not about convincing somebody to do something they don't want to do. It's about showing them how the solution that you've got solves their problem. Well, you got to be pretty confident that it does in order to be able to do that convincing. And that's selling. And the thing that most people don't like about selling is you have to put yourself out there. You have to put your ideas out there, and you have to make claims in the world like, oh, I can solve your pain. Now, people are going to disagree with you. People are going to tell you no. People will even say, I don't have that pain. You think they have that pain? They say, I don't have that pain. And oh, by the way, I'm slightly offended that you would tell me I have that pain. We're going to get told no a lot. And there's not going to be progress indicators, no mile markers. So we've got to consistently be courageous and tenacious in the face of this and continue to seek feedback. Feedback is how you find out how to modify your idea such that people can get their arms around it and it becomes more valuable to them. It solves their problems better. So that's the linchpin kind of role and why it's hard. Now let's take a minute and compare that to the traditional 20th century kind of career that we talked about earlier. I'll say if people can write up a position, a job ad, then the work they're looking for can't be that challenging. Now, in this situation with unchallenging work, your competition is one or both of two things. One of these things is a computer, which works very inexpensively. And two is somebody that's happy to do it for a lot less than it's going to take to get you to do it. And this was Thomas Friedman in The World is Flat. So we need to be preparing ourselves for these linchpin kinds of challenges. And I say this particularly if you're a younger person and new to your career. Go ahead and get prepared for this. Learn how to operate in this environment. So let's back up and give some context to this whole talk, and then we'll discuss how to go about preparing yourself. Because we've thrown around a lot of theory, and I want to get that concrete. I typically talk about attention, and this talk is that next level up. So just to clarify, attention compass is nuts and bolts of how to go about doing what you know you need to do. If you want an analogy, you'll sometimes see athletes running the rope ladder that's lying there on the ground, and they're putting their feet in and out of it, and they're getting quicker. They're learning and practicing technique to get better and faster. And that's where attention compass is in the knowledge work. It's technique and tactics to do the things that you already know you need to do. Another way to say it is attention compass is about when you pick up a piece of information, here's what to do with it. Here's how to, for example, put it down properly. You get an email, here's what to do with email. I don't teach you how to do email, I teach you what to do with email. And that's where attention comes in. Now, the discussion we're having today is that next level up, as I've said. And it's more about which piece of paper do I pick up? In the metaphor, it's do I need to be practicing running the rope ladder? Or do I need to be practicing flipping tires? If we think about it from an attention compass perspective, we'll say things like, I've gotten good at managing information and attention. In what direction should I apply those skills? So that's what we're talking about today. I want to be very careful because I don't usually address that. You come to attention compass with your own set of things to do. Now, here we're talking about the things that we should be doing. And that's becoming a linchpin and overcoming the resistance, putting your ideas out there and learning to accept feedback from other people. Now, can attention compass help you do that? I think very much so, and we'll talk about why now that we've put this in context. Now, I want us to think about one more idea, which is this resistance, and another reason why it's hard to do the things that you'll need to do. You have to be talking to people about what their pain is, and you have to be open to the feedback they give you on whether or not your solution solves their pain. And you have to initiate those conversations. Well, here's the problem. In my career with Attention Compass, I'm constantly amazed at how people will put up with pain in their lives. Now, it's usually because they don't know there's a solution to the pain. But either way, people say things like, you know what, I'll just do what everybody else is doing. It'll be okay. Well, everybody else is freaked out. The idea that you just want to live like everybody else lives, that's the lizard brain talk. The lizard brain says things like, I'd rather live with pain than live with fear and or uncertainty. So there's a skill you have to develop there. And again, kind of back to sales, back to the skill of picking up the phone and talking to the next stranger. Here's the picture. You just hung up the phone with a stranger, and you're going to pick up the phone and you're going to say to the next stranger, hey, let me tell you about my thing. Let me figure out about this pain with you because I think you have it. And if that stranger says, nope, not interested, then you've got to figure out a way to get enough information from them so that the call is useful to you, so that you learn something. You've got to be a little bit persistent and ask, well, why not? Or what's your objection? Or how did I miss the mark on your pain? These kinds of conversations and people telling you or not telling you how to get better at what you do, and having these conversations all the time gets old. And again, that's the fear. Oh, they don't like my idea, so they don't like me. And it's a skill, really, just to have the guts to do that. So what do? Well, we begin to work on the skills and we begin to develop feedback mechanisms in our world. We begin to get used to feedback. You can do this as early as in school. You can start learning this. So your professor, your teacher gives you a B. And instead of the immediate reaction of, oh, well, they're a jerk and they're mean to me and they don't understand my problems. Instead, you can learn to go, well, what do I do with this feedback? How do I alter my behavior or my process in the face of this feedback? Now, if you can develop that skill, then you're ahead of 98% of the population. Godin goes pretty far along the path of saying that our education system does us a disservice in these ways, primarily because it makes us believe that learning is all about reading a textbook. Now, for some small value of learning, that can be true. But another whole area in the much larger area of learning is experimental. And experimental learning is truly valuable. So in terms of preparation, we need to learn how to structure good experiments and get data from them. We need to learn to talk to people about that and understand their position and what their feedback is and learn to take advantage of that feedback. Now, most of us don't learn that. Most of us learn the textbook model, the educational model. And if so, then we're going to go out into the world to do our thing and we're going to look for a textbook to do it. But if you believe that you need to be in this linchpin state, if you're in the knowledge economy, or if you're creating and developing your own stuff, if you're a thought leader, there is no textbook. And so it's a bad strategy to be looking for it. Instead, think you're writing the textbook. You're inventing this as you go, experimentally. Now, in some ways, this is obvious because if people knew how to tell you what they wanted, they'd build it for themselves. They don't need somebody new in their life solving these problems. If they knew how to solve it, they'd be solving it. So they don't know. And you've got to constantly be in the education business so that they begin to know. Now, there's good news. There are people that'll help you along the way to do this. There are people that'll teach you components of what's going on. There are plenty of people, for example, that will teach you what they know about selling. But here, you've got to invest in yourself. And that means both time and dollars. And being willing to continue to make those investments. Because first we do it investing in ourselves, and then we need to do it investing in the product. Now, most people are not willing to invest in themselves. Most people have other purposes for their dollars and their time. But you can learn to invest in yourself and turn yourself into the kind of person who can pull this off. As an example, maybe the challenge is to come home from your 8 to 5 normal routine gig and put in a couple hours every night on making your thing work. Maybe that's the challenge you face. Oh, I'm tired. Well, that's the resistance. Now, the resistance has lots of forms, but you can tell them all by noticing that they have one thing in common. They don't want you to do what you want to do. That's where we are in the bigger picture. Seth Godin talks about the problem, talks about this linchpin problem, and Steven Pressfield helps you figure out how to deal with the challenges of that from a psychological perspective, from a motivation perspective. I think that there's still a gap in that at the Pressfield level, he's not great on that procedural approach for how to deal with this. And as I mentioned before, that's the attention compass. Attention compass is really, really good at helping you do the things you know you need to do anyway. Now, the primary way that we don't do what we know we need to do, we call procrastination. Learning how to not procrastinate is a fundamental feature of attention compass. And we teach how to do that, and we put tools and process around not procrastinating. When the task comes up, you do the task. And we talk about this in practical ways all the time. Some ideas, divide it up into little chunks, schedule it at an appropriate time, All these different ideas of productivity workflow fit in here. We've got a lot of them. Now, I will say the attention compass model of productivity is not go faster, 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 110, 120%. The attention compass model of productivity is go ahead and do the stuff that you normally don't do and that other people are not willing to do. Go ahead and do those things, and that'll make you more productive. We don't talk about it a lot, but one of the big wastes, one of the big leakages in our productivity is this business of having to work ourselves up to do something. How much effort and time and attention do we put into avoiding things we'd rather not do? And that's where attention compass fits in and will really help you along this path to some sort of a linchpin kind of role, and thus a career that's really valuable, really fulfilling, and thus attacking both productivity and the work-life balance questions. I'll give you a little more context. All of this that we're discussing today goes back to Drucker, Peter Drucker, and his core question, which is, what do we do about the productivity of knowledge workers? And that's really what Godin is talking about. He's talking about becoming a top-notch knowledge worker. If you're a knowledge worker, you're creating. And I don't care what you create. Write a book, write a technical book, write a programming book, write a recipe book, and you'll face the resistance. It doesn't have to be creative in the artistic sense. It can just be creative in the getting something to exist that never existed before sense. And if that's true, then the resistance is going to show up. And my claim is that attention compass will help you break that down into doable tasks that don't get procrastinated. So that's just bigger picture. So let's do a recap. Here's where we got to in our thinking. We know that the 21st century work environment is different from the 20th century work environment. Seth Godin talks about this in Linchpin. You can't do routine stuff and expect to have a meaningful, valuable career. Now, by the way, Seth is not the only one that talks about this. Cal Newport writes good books and comes to similar conclusions. So the point is you got to get out there and do unusual stuff, unusually meaningful stuff. Because otherwise, you're going to compete with a computer or somebody who is happy to do what you do for 1/10 of what you make. And then you're going to lose that battle. So we develop these new ways to produce value. Well, if we're doing it in ways that other people can't describe it, they can't teach us and train us. And we're going to lack feedback. Let me say that in a different way. There aren't going to be mile markers. And that's where the resistance creeps in. If there's not mile markers, the resistance begins to show up when you create. And the resistance is all kind of different voices. The voice that says, I'm not good enough. The voice that says, I don't have the credentials to do this. The voice that says, I'm not a good public speaker. The voice that says, well, I just don't like doing X, Y, and Z. All these different voices and ideas are different forms of the resistance. And Pressfield talks to us about how to deal with that from a psychology perspective. Summarizing still, Pressfield's basic prescription is to quit thinking about whether or not you dislike it and just do it. Now, he's talking primarily to writers, but it's good stuff for anybody that's creating by the definition that we used before. So get and read The War of Art to help you deal with that. Now, I add that the other piece of dealing with the resistance is the procedural piece. Pressfield's got the mental piece. And now I'm going to help you with the procedural piece, which is if you know you need to do something and your brain doesn't want to do it, how do you get it to do it anyway? And that's where attention compass comes in. The ability to focus, this ability to do what we've pre-decided that we will do. And we build habits around both pre-deciding to do something and then when the time comes, doing what you pre-decided to do. Zooming all the way out, in summary, We've been thinking about what makes a meaningful and valuable career. And I'll say it's some level of economic success, along with some level of understanding the value of what it is that you do. If you put those things together, meaningful work and decent economic results, I claim the work-life balance thing goes away. If you're doing what you're good at and you're recognizing that it produces value in the world, you're not on somebody else's clock, then it's easier to have a great career. So we talked about the skills you'll want to get together. I'd say dealing with the resistance is one set of skills, and then attention compass is another set of skills that you'll need to have in order to be able to do this linchpin thing and do it well. We talked about a couple other things. We talked about beginning to develop sources of feedback and beginning to learn how to listen to them. What I mean here is learn how to not get offended when people say they don't like your stuff. That shouldn't trigger anger. It should trigger curiosity. Say, oh, that's interesting. I don't usually hear that, but I am anxious for you to tell me what you think. And then developing the skill to be able to sort that out, to decide whether that particular feedback is useful or not. And the decision of whether feedback is useful or not useful is not just a knee-jerk reaction. The resistance will get in there. So this decision of usefulness is a thoughtful thing. And if it's going to be thoughtful, you can't be afraid of the feedback. So we need to learn that skill and learn the skill of living without reassurance, of living without progress markers. I think that's valuable for you, and I hope you see the value there. As always, I'd love to hear from you on this. Alternately, if you found it useful, share it with somebody like you, somebody who cares about this stuff and is working on it. In any event, if you'd like, email me at larry@dobusywright.com or connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm not hard to find, and I'd love to meet whoever it is you introduce to the podcast. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the attention compass process. Attention compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusywright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.